Part 4, Walking on Broken Glass, 1982 to 1992, Chapter 13, The Survivors Build the Rainbow. The nationwide groups that survived beyond 1982 were in denial about the party-building movement's overall collapse, but on the level of practical politics they had learned a great deal from their predecessors' failures and their own experience. The League for Revolutionary Struggle and Rectification especially had no illusions that U.S. workers were about to embrace socialism en masse. Their leaderships had become skilled at coordinating campaigns, deploying cadre and producing polished propaganda, as well as infighting within the left. Tenacious and battle-hardened, they had watched larger organizations fall apart and were determined to avoid the same fate. The ironic result was that in the 1980s these organizations operated with more tactical acuity and professionalism than any anti-revisionist group had during the movement's heyday. They were still afflicted by doctrinal narrowness and by the sectarianism that flows from seeing oneself as inherently destined for leadership. Still, the efforts of LRS, rectification, and a few smaller survivors displayed considerable flexibility and insight. In particular, these groups recognized earlier than almost anyone else on the left that the black-led rainbow upsurge crystallized in Jesse Jackson's two presidential campaigns would become the frontline contingent in the fight against Reaganism. They plunged into that motion quickly and wholeheartedly, pushing the rainbow forward and acquiring a much-needed political anchor in the process. They did not win leadership of broad masses, but they did manage to function as the most sophisticated sects the new communist movement ever produced. Dilemmas of party building in the 1980s. These survivors were fortunate that Jackson and the Rainbow came along. The 1980s presented immense challenges to anyone claiming the legacy of anti-revisionism. First, the broad revolutionary current that had originated in the late 1960s and surrounded Marxist-Leninist groups during the 1970s had disappeared. This eliminated the milieu that had donated funds, subscribed to newspapers, and generally provided moral and political support. Second, the rightward turn in national politics, while provoking popular resistance, also made it more difficult for activists to retain the previous decade's revolutionary optimism. In these circumstances, keeping up sufficient morale to sustain the intense workload of a small communist group required a lot of deft ideological and organizational footwork. Beyond these general problems, there were particular dilemmas that differed from group to group depending on their outlook. Above all, which side they had chosen in the mid-1970s split over China's foreign policy. For the groups that followed China, Beijing's foreign policy still created embarrassing predicaments. Distressed by the Reagan administration's support for Taiwan, after 1982 China again offered some mild criticisms of the U.S., but Beijing continued to side with Washington against national liberation movements supported by the USSR, short of going over to an open right-wing posture. This meant that a careful balancing act was required to maintain support for China while participating in peace or anti-intervention movements. Simultaneously, the CPC's total turnabout regarding the Cultural Revolution and its ever more obvious turn to capitalist mechanisms to spur China's economy put Beijing's supporters in an ideological bind. Those who had broken with China seemingly had a more stable niche. There was no barrier preventing them from wholeheartedly supporting the decade's most progressive Third World movements, El Salvador's FMLN, the PLO, and especially the Marxist tendencies within it, South Africa's African National Congress, and the governments of Nicaragua, Cuba, Vietnam, Angola, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe. All these were allied with the USSR to varying degrees, but most were identified with policies, especially concerning armed struggle, that were to the left of the cautious approach that the CPCU had emphasized during the late 1960s. Within the U.S., meanwhile, the CPUSA still demonstrated a strong tendency to adapt its policies to the outlook of the trade union leadership and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, thus leaving a space to its left for a Marxist current anchoring itself in anti-imperialism, anti-racism, and bottom-up mobilization. But these advantages did not translate easily into a coherent ideological outlook and party-building strategy. For one thing, the more anti-dogmatists deepened their criticism of CPC policies, the more they came up against the need to rethink the whole anti-revisionist framework they had inherited from the Chinese. It was easy to critique Deng Xiaoping's alignment with the U.S. and his market-oriented economic policies, but how far back should the critique of CPC policies extend? Defending the Cultural Revolution was hardly attractive to groups whose identity was bound up with a critique of ultra-leftism, but repudiating the policies of both Mao and Deng either sent one backwards toward defense of Stalin, not an attractive option, or raised uncomfortable questions about the validity of the whole anti-revisionist edifice. It didn't help matters that not a single one of the parties and movements to which the anti-dogmatists looked for inspiration, the Cubans, Vietnamese, South Africans, and others, regarded the Soviet Party as revisionist. But if the CPSU was not revisionist, then the CPUSA had been pilloried largely for following the CPSU. What was the ideological basis for forming an alternative party to the CPUSA? For a large organization with a significant working class base and clear-cut differences with the CPUSA on immediate political issues, such theoretical dilemmas might not pose many problems, but small groups defining themselves as party builders needed a deeper doctrinal foundation. As long as activists accepted the premise that there was a single genuine revolutionary tradition that passed from Marx and Lenin through the Third International to the modern era, and that articulating an orthodox expression of that tradition was the key to forging a vanguard party, there was no obvious way to supply the needed theoretical strategic program, new opportunities. These fundamental dilemmas were pushed temporarily into the background by new opportunities in practical work. In 1983, a progressive electoral groundswell anchored in the black community began to make itself felt, first in Harold Washington's successful campaign for mayor of Chicago and then in Jesse Jackson's drive for the 1984 Democratic presidential nomination. Insistence on the pivotal role of the black liberation movement had long been a central element of anti-revisionist thinking, and the largest remaining groups responded to its resurgence with enthusiasm. The black political revival and the response of other sectors to it seemed to conform to key elements of their analysis and strategy, boosting their self-confidence just when they needed it most. Meanwhile, on the organizational level, LRS and the Rectification Group had grown to the point where they were well positioned to make an impact. After its formation in 1978 and the affiliation of RCL in 1979, LRS had to devote special attention to developing its internal cohesion. The task was complicated because of the disparate histories of its three component parts and the fact that each reflected, at least to a degree, a strain of nationalist sentiment rooted in a different oppressed community, Asian, Chicano, and Black. Operational leadership of the group remained almost exclusively in the hands of the original IWK Corps, which was anchored by several skilled women cadre. Indeed, LRS and the DWK were the only major new communist groups in which a woman held the very top leadership position and exercised ultimate political authority. Key leaders from ATEAM, Bill Gallegos, and RCL, Amiri Baraka, held high posts and were prominent spokespeople but did not participate in the day-to-day leadership body. Doctrinally, LRS stuck to Maoist fundamentals in regarding the USSR as capitalist and affirming the existence of a distinct black nation in the South and Chicano nation in the Southwest. The biggest change from the typical anti-revisionist program of the 1970s was LRS's more grounded perspective on strategy and tactics. The group's 1984 program stated that the revolution would be a protracted process, that the main forms of struggle in the U.S. Revolution will be legal forms, and that a new generation would have to learn about the bankruptcy of bourgeois democracy through its own direct experience in trying to participate in existing institutions. LRS did not place much priority on theoretical work. During 1979 and 1980, the group issued 3 issues of a new journal, Forward, a journal of Marxism, Leninism, Mao Zedong thought, and then let the publication lapse for 5 years. In 1985, it was sporadically revived as Journal of Socialist Thought. The organization put much more time and energy into publishing the polished semi-monthly newspaper Unity, which appeared in English, Spanish, and English-Chinese editions. LRS devoted much effort to work in the Asian and Chicano communities and to a lesser extent in the black community, and to getting its members rooted in trade unions with a high proportion of members of color. In labor, LRS cadre led several important battles, and the group played a central role in the bitter 1985 to 1986 18-month struggle of mostly Latina cannery workers to win a contract with medical benefits in Watsonville, California. In campus agitation, LRS projected the concept of a broad anti-Reagan front with particular emphasis on anti-racism, a framework with strong appeal to progressive students of color. The combination of this perspective with many years of experience in student organizing yielded substantial gains, with LRS winning over a higher percentage of 1980s student activists than any other socialist group. By the late 1980s, LRS had grown to nearly 1,000 members, upwards of 75% of them first radicalized in the 1980s. New members were expected to put numerous hours into disciplined political work, but ideologically it was sufficient to express a general desire for revolution. Their education in Marxism-Leninism was to be conducted once they were inside the organization. In practice, this education was uneven. and for most new recruits party building remained distant from their core political identity, which was more bound up with LRS's immediate practical work. In composition, LRS was roughly 75 to 1980% activists of color. Rectification becomes line of march. The main survivor from the anti-dogmatist trend, the Rectification Network, also used the early 1980s to build up a strong apparatus. Rectification gave far more weight to theoretical and historical analysis than LRS. It was the only party-building effort that started a theoretical journal before launching a newspaper. Rectification's journal first appeared in spring 1980 under the name Line of March, a phrase taken from the Communist Manifesto. Theoretically, communists have over the great mass of the proletariat the advantage of clearly understanding the line of march, the conditions and the ultimate general results of the proletarian movement. The title immediately became the name used for the Rectificationists' network as well as the journal. While this accurately reflected the group's emphasis on Marxist theory, in image terms Line of March was arguably the worst name ever chosen by a party-building group, even before the organization's opponents began to refer to it as March in Line. The journal itself was intellectually serious, if ponderous, and by producing 16 issues between 1980 and 1984, Line of March set the new communist movement's record for sustained theoretical production. It also continued its sponsor's unusual combination of innovation and orthodoxy. For a strategic formula, Line of March rejected the CPC-derived formula of a united front against imperialism and elaborated a strategy termed the United Front Against War and Racism. According to Line of March, militarism, imperialism, and racism were the distinctive pillars of U.S. capitalism both historically and structurally, while racism and national chauvinism were the main obstacles to unity in the working class. Line of March's framework shared a number of similarities with the CPUSA's strategy of anti-monopoly coalition, both derived via different logics from the 1930s United Front Against Fascism. It simultaneously shared with LRS and the dominant tradition of anti-revisionism an emphasis on the crucial role of the lower disproportionately people of color, strata of workers. In another argument unusual for anti-revisionist groups, Line of March stressed that its proposed united front was not simply a tactic to gather backing for the Marxist-Leninists. Forging a broad united front of different trends, tendencies, organizations, and parties in the working class movement is not a tactical mechanism through which the communists try to gather sufficient forces to someday go it alone. Rather, it is a strategic vehicle in which communists must maintain alliances with other conceal-us forces right through the revolutionary seizure of power. For emphasis in original, Line of March likewise departed from tradition by arguing that a fresh Marxist analysis of white supremacy and racism that did not limit itself to applying the national question framework was an urgent necessity given the central role of the color line in U.S. history. The group paid close attention to different trends in the women's movement and integrated both anti-sexism and defense of lesbian gay rights into its united front perspective. At the same time, Line of March was obsessed with analyzing and reanalyzing the world communist movement in order to identify the boundaries of its postulatal genuine Marxism-Leninism. By the end of 1981, Line of March had repudiated its initial position that it was situated within an anti-dogmatist wing of a divided anti-revisionist movement. Instead, it concluded that Maoism was outside the communist movement altogether and that there was a single international communist movement with two trends, one revisionist trend anchored in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the US, the CPUSA, and one Marxist-Leninist trend, without a center internationally, but anchored by Line of March in the US. Gradually, the group adopted an even more positive view of the CPSU and USSR. It supported the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the 1981 crackdown on solidarity in Poland, and its newspaper carried articles sympathetic to the Soviet and Cuban-backed Ethiopian regime's military struggle against Eritrea's fight for national independence. In 1984, Line of March went so far as to withdraw the claim that the CPSU or CPUSA were revisionist. Instead, both parties were charged with making right opportunist errors. Line of March did not shrink from the logical conclusion that the need to build a new vanguard outside of the CPUSA was no longer a matter of principle. While still declaring that party building was the central task, Line of March now argued that building an apparatus outside the CPUSA was only a tactical necessity, and it held out hopes for some kind of shift in CPUSA policy that could result in merging the two organizations. In practical work, Line of March gave priority to anti-racist and anti-intervention campaigns. In both arenas, it set up revolutionary mass organizations under its leadership, the National Anti-Racist Organizing Committee (NROC) and the Peace and Solidarity Alliance (SA). Relative to LRE's, Line of March gave less attention to campus and trade union organizing and more to work in the women's movement, where it led another revolutionary mass organization, the Alliance Against Women's Oppression, a direct descendant of the Third World Women's Alliance. With a significant proportion of its leadership coming out of KDP's work in the Filipino community, Line of March maintained its solidarity efforts with the Communist Party of the Philippines, despite growing differences over international perspective by the KDP and other groups. With its efforts to build anti-Marcos sentiment in the U.S. achieving substantial results, KDP came under direct attack from the Marcos dictatorship. These attacks included the commissioning of murder, and on June 1, 1981, Seattle activists Jean Viernes and Silmy Domingo were assassinated in the office of Alaska Cannery Workers Local 27, International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union (ILWU), by street gang members later proved to have been hired by the Marcos regime. Viernes' Local 37 dispatcher and Domingo secretary-treasurer were members of KDP and less publicly Line of March. A month earlier they had been instrumental in pressing the ILWU to pass an anti-Marcos resolution at its international convention in Hawaii. The Justice for Domingo and Viernes campaign that followed the murders was a key step in developing both the professionalism and the broad coalition-building approach of Line of March. It was ultimately successful in winning conviction of the killers, exposing the intelligence agents linking the triggermen to Marcos, and obtaining a large monetary settlement for the families of the two slain activists. In 1983, Line of March launched a bi-weekly newspaper, Frontline. By this time it had built a nationwide apparatus comparable in scope of activity, though smaller in numbers, about 400, than the LRS. The group was roughly 35–40% activists of color, with people of color making up a majority of the leadership. By 1983, Line of March no longer operated in a semi-clandestine fashion, and from that point on fielded a large number of open members. LRS and Line of March were bitter rivals, partly because of doctrinal differences, partly because of scars left from the up-close battles between them over Angola and NCOBD versus a BDC in the 1970s, and partly due to competition stretching back to the late 1960s when a high percentage of the leaderships of both groups, in particular the original IWK and KDP corps, had known each other well but had gone in different directions. Jesse Jackson and the Rainbow. It's easy to see why these and other surviving party builders would be enthusiastic about the movement behind Harold Washington, Jesse Jackson, and the Rainbow Coalition. This stirring didn't take the same form as the civil rights Black Power motion of the 1960s, and its leading figures did not emerge out of the grassroots left, but in essential outline the upsurge conformed to many of the core ideas held by new communist movement veterans. First, it had its strongest social base among the dispossessed within the African American community, where class exploitation and racial oppression intersected. As had been the case so often in U.S. history, most recently in the civil rights era, this sector's mobilization behind a progressive program was driving forward all democratic movements. Moreover, from its springboard in the fight against racism, this upsurge was driven to challenge Reaganism in general, and this dynamic provided the basis for the economic common ground and moral higher ground themes that crystallized Jackson's multi-sector appeal. Likewise, the movement challenged U.S. foreign policy, from South Africa to Central America to the Middle East, to Reagan's drive for nuclear superiority, especially via dramatic trips on the part of Jackson himself. Thus the political program of the Jackson Rainbow movement, while not revolutionary, went well beyond the parameters of mainstream politics. Yet by bringing this program into the Democratic primary contests, the Jackson campaign found a mechanism to present its message to tens of millions and mobilize a nationwide apparatus. This meant a direct confrontation with white supremacy, in the form of the white electoral backlash, as well as conflict with accommodationist black leaders who were crucial to maintaining the hegemony of bourgeois politics in the African American community. Especially for activists who continued the new communist movement legacy of seeing these fights as indispensable for uniting workers of all colors, the Jackson Rainbow motion thus offered tremendous opportunity, even more so when it seemed that Jackson was willing to build a rainbow coalition that would undertake non-electoral as well as electoral activism and remain independent of official Democratic Party structures, and even distinct from his own campaign structure. While the most sophisticated anti-revisionist survivors had already decided that at times they needed to support Democratic candidates, up until the early 1980s they remained wary of direct involvement in Democratic Party-linked structures. maintaining justified concerns about losing all independent initiative. Now the rainbow offered the prospect of a durable, mass-based and independent vehicle, one which revolutionaries could join and loyally help build. While retaining the freedom to advocate their own distinct points of view, the rainbow's potential didn't just attract the most grounded Marxist-Leninist remnants. It also galvanized many African-American revolutionary nationalists, such as NBIPP veteran Ron Daniels, first executive director of the Rainbow, and progressive black elected officials, such as Rep. Ron Dellums, who had gone in different directions when the alliance momentarily crystallized in the 1972 National Black Political Assembly had splintered a decade earlier. Likewise, it attracted other sectors of the left who had focused on the centrality of the anti-racist fight, in particular the network of organizers who made up the National Committee for Independent Political Action, NCIP, unaffiliated leftists from the full range of popular movements, from the Native American and Arab American communities to the peace and lesbian gay movement, also signed on. In terms of tangible results, the first breakthrough came in the spring of 1983, when Harold Washington won a stunning upset over Jane Byrne and Richard M. Daley, SON of Chicago's longtime mayor Richard J. Daley, for the Democratic Party's mayoral nomination. Then in April, despite the defection of tens of thousands of traditionally Democratic whites, Washington won the general election. His margin of victory was supplied by a huge African-American turnout supplemented by alliances forged with Latinos, sections of the labor movement, and white progressives. For the next 4.5 years, the Washington Coalition engaged in no-holds-barred political warfare against a Chicago machine still entrenched in the city council. Washington won re-election in April 1987, but the coalition he led was unable to survive his sudden death 7 months later. In the wake of Washington's victory, activists began to consider more seriously the idea being floated by Jesse Jackson for a black presidential candidate, presumably himself. Momentum spread during that summer's organizing for a demonstration in Washington, D.C. to mark the 20th anniversary of the historic August 1963 March on Washington. The action mobilized more than 350,000 people under the theme of jobs, peace, and freedom. The march's general militancy and its inclusion of a demand for peace in particular caused Cold Warriors such as Bayard Rustin and the AFL-CIO leadership to stonewall the effort, prefiguring the polarization between the Jackson-led rainbow tendency and the establishment liberal labor officialdom black accommodationist alignment that would characterize the rest of the decade. At the August 27 march itself, Jackson was cheered with constant chants of "Run, Jesse, run." On November 3, Jackson officially announced his candidacy, throwing down the gauntlet not just to Reagan but to the influential forces in the Democratic Party who were conciliating Reaganism on every point. With this electoral insurgency now fully underway, it was far easier for movement survivors to focus on opportunities than to address their own underlying ideological instability, all the more so since their main rivals on the left failed to match their enthusiasm for the rainbow. The most glaring failure was DSI's. Though Jackson's 1984 candidacy marked the first time in decades that an essentially social democratic program had mobilized mass electoral support, and despite the fact that Jackson pursued the favored social democratic policy of running as a Democrat, DSA stayed mostly aloof from the first Jackson campaign. The reasons lay in DS's white racial blind spot, its reluctance to take any stance that might strain ties with AFL-CIO officialdom, which engineered an early endorsement of Walter Mondale, and the Zionist influence within its ranks. In 1988, when Jackson ran a more broad-based effort, DSA was more supportive, but its prestige in rainbow circles never recovered from its 1984 abstention. At the other end of the left spectrum, Trotskyist organizations shunned the Rainbow Coalition because of their opposition to any involvement whatsoever in the Democratic Party. This stance isolated them from the main progressive motion of the decade. The CPUSA did much better, but it still pursued an ambiguous policy. The CP played a stronger role than any other left organization in Washington's Chicago campaign, where long-standing roots in the black community served the party especially well. But unlike Washington, who after winning the Democratic primary had the at least nominal support of key unions and big-name white Democrats, the Jackson campaigns challenged the favored candidates of the labor-liberal bloc. The CP was thus torn between an impulse to support a black-led progressive insurgency and its long-standing strategy of orienting principally to the trade union movement and the labor leadership. With some members dissenting and a degree of inconsistency, The CP ended up hailing the rainbow, but also declaring that the AFL-CIO's endorsement of Mondale was an equally significant expression of independent initiative. On the ground, the CP operated with one foot inside the Jackson effort and one foot outside, with many members confused throughout the decade about what constituted the party's line. With rivals pursuing such policies, it was easy for groups like LRS and Line of March to feel smug about their own politics. How could there be any basic problems when their line propelled them into the thick of the decade's main progressive upsurge while other trends equivocated? And not only did their cadre plunge in, they took on major responsibilities, with campaign committees and rainbow structures sprouting all over during late 1983 and 1984, and with traditional Democratic Party operatives hostile or hanging back. There was plenty of room for skilled leftists to assume leadership posts. LRS and Line of March cadre played the largest roles, but PUL, RWH, CWP and CLP also made their presence felt, as did a number of independent left veterans of other party-building groups. 7 million votes. This is not the place to detail the story and immense impact of the Jackson campaigns and the Rainbow Coalition, which have been the subject of several comprehensive studies. It will be sufficient to note a few highlights. In 1984, Jackson won 20% of the Democratic primary vote and 80% of the black vote despite opposition from virtually the entire Democratic establishment and condescending if not outright racist treatment by the media. At the Democratic convention itself, Jackson was a magnetic presence, and his primetime speech captured the largest television audience of any convention event. After the meeting, Jackson's energized base was the main counter to the strong rightward pulls on the Mondale campaign. He was credited with mobilizing a large portion of the African American vote, which prevented Reagan's eventual landslide from being even larger than it was. Between 1984 and 1988, Jackson functioned as the main progressive standard-bearer in the national spotlight, bridging the long-standing gap between mainstream electoral and grassroots progressive politics. Jackson was highly visible in the surge of anti-apartheid protests, which began just after Reagan's 1984 re-election, and he was the keynote speaker at the large April 20, 1985 demonstration for peace, jobs, and justice. Simultaneously, local chapters of the Rainbow Coalition became centers of progressive activity in dozens of localities, and the Rainbow began to take shape as a nationwide institution. Jackson and the Rainbow were a force in the 1986 midterm elections in which the Democrats kept control of the House and regained control of the Senate, largely on the strength of black votes in the South. In October 1987, the Rainbow Coalition held its first regular convention, at which 1,200 delegates and observers from 38 states adopted an official program and set of bylaws. A much expanded white stripe in the rainbow was in evidence, and on the convention's final day, Jackson traveled to the Capitol to speak and receive huge cheers at the 500,000-plus National March on Washington for lesbian and gay rights. The theme of economic common ground was the centerpiece of Jackson's 1988 campaign, which reached far deeper into the electorate than his 1984 bid. Jackson received 7 million votes in the primaries, the highest ever total for someone who did not win the nomination. The campaign galvanized the black community and progressive activists in all sectors. Particularly noteworthy was the emergence of a strong labor for Jackson movement, within which activists from the surviving Marxist-Leninist groups played a key role. Throughout this period, the Jackson Rainbow movement drew strength from and also contributed to a host of other energetic movements. Constant actions were mobilized against Reagan's wars in Central America, anti-apartheid activism spread nationwide, and anti-nuclear and anti-Star Wars campaigns gained widespread support. On domestic issues, the heightening AIDS crisis sparked a surge of activism in the lesbian gay movement and spurred the development of new kinds of in-your-face protests with the formation of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. In March 1987, the women's movement mobilized against attacks on abortion rights, the labor movement battled against concessions, and a large-scale immigrant rights movement developed in opposition first to the passage and then to the implementation of the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986. A new people of color-based environmental justice movement appeared after the Commission for Racial Justice of the United Church of Christ released its landmark report Toxic Waste and Race in the United States in 1987. Each of these movements had its own independent thrust and dynamic, but with the Rainbow Coalition organizational and Jesse Jackson personally offering support and able to bring each particular struggle into the nationwide spotlight, it was common for links to be forged. Jackson, the Rainbow, and specific local and sectoral movements all benefited from this process. So did the revolutionary organizations that had thrown themselves into the rainbow. They acquired both a stabilizing anchor and a way to expand their reach and influence. The Rainbow Left. Within the Jackson Rainbow movement, anti-revisionism's survivors shouldered at least their share of precinct walking, fundraising, literature distribution, and the like. They strove to bring diverse constituencies into the movement and frequently took the lead in sectors where Jackson initially had few ties. LR's cadre played a point role in mobilizing support in many Asian American communities and among Chicano and Asian American students. Line of March members set the main rainbow pole within the Filipino community and contributed heavily to mobilizing support in the women's movement, the peace and anti-intervention movement, and the lesbian and gay movement. Both groups supplied key activists for efforts in Chicano communities and in labor. Members of both organizations, but especially LRS, gained positions of influence within the campaign and the Rainbow, and a few members or sympathizers were even elected as Jackson delegates to the Democratic National Convention. The two main surviving groups pursued different policies in their Rainbow Jackson work. LRS emphasized what traditional communist doctrine termed a united front from above, then worked to forge strong ties with Jackson's inner circle, local elected officials, and labor and community leaders. The organization pressed for structures and tactics that would be comfortable for figures with an established base, and were reluctant to set up a bottom-up membership-based rainbow on the grounds that it would give disproportionate influence to small but active left groups. LRS was likewise more willing than most others on the left to subordinate building the rainbow to the immediate needs of Jackson's campaign apparatus when these were considered by Jackson to be at least partly in conflict. Line of March, in contrast, stressed the importance of a rainbow structure based among grassroots activists who had a major say in decision-making. It was opposed to allowing the rainbow to languish outside campaign time, and was willing to engage in open fights over policy with what it saw as more accommodationist forces. Line of March argued that this approach was needed if the rainbow was to mature into a progressive vehicle that was not completely dependent on the appeal of its charismatic standard-bearer or susceptible to pressures from the Democratic Party high command. While supplying probably the largest single contingent of base-level cadre advocating this approach, Line of March was not its most influential proponent. That role fell to a loose alignment of independent activists, activist lawyer Arthur Kinoy and Rainbow executive director Ron Daniels prominent among them. Many of these activists were linked together via NCIPA, which became a key information sharing and strategy generating hub for those advocating a grassroots-based rainbow. PUL counted itself among these advocates as well. Its work in 1984 was limited by the group's small size and the fact that it hardly operated outside its Boston home base. But in 1985 to 1986, PUL combined with the remnants of the RWH and the small organization of Revolutionary Unity to form the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, FRSO. Even this expanded group remained considerably smaller than LRA's or Line of March and did not have those organizations' capacity to publish newspapers and journals. Though its support for China and the Three Worlds theory matched LRS's, FRSO had major differences with that group on party-building strategy and other issues. In regard to Jackson and the Rainbow, its strategy was similar to that of Line of March and NCIPA, and with the latter FRSO cadre established good working ties. The main 1980s regroupment effort that included new communist movement veterans, the North Star Network, also oriented to the Rainbow and shared this perspective for work within it, as did The Guardian. A common orientation to the Rainbow thus put activists from Line of March, NCIPA, FRSO and North Star, as well as many unaffiliated socialists and revolutionary nationalists, in increasing contact with one another. Though friction characterized some of their interactions, their alignment on the same side of most internal rainbow struggles gradually wore down the sharpest tensions. Over time, they coalesced into what was loosely termed a rainbow left based upon support for a grassroots democratic vision of the rainbow. Especially after 1986, individual members of DSA, disproportionately drawn from DSA's small people of color membership, also gravitated to this milieu, and cooperation was occasionally established with CPU-SA cadre as well. Individual members of CLP likewise intersected with the Rainbow Left alignment, though the development of formal ties was constrained by CLP's policy of extreme secrecy. All cadre except for a handful of national spokespeople kept their membership a secret. All in all, the fact that cadre from such a diverse array of otherwise competing left tendencies were thrown together in common work was another sign of the Rainbow's potential, not just to reach millions with a progressive message, but to set a favorable context for left groups to put cooperation ahead of competition. the CWP and DWP dissolve. Not every group that managed to survive the new communist movement's 1980 to 1981 implosion found a mooring within the rainbow. The Communist Workers' Party participated in Jackson's 1984 campaign, but by this time had turned its main attention to a full-scale internal overhaul. The CWP had previously advocated an intransigent and extremely left version of Marxism-Leninism, but by 1984 it had become clear even to the cadre who had formulated this viewpoint that revolution was nowhere near imminent. This naturally led to a re-evaluation of strategy, but General Secretary Jerry Tung went further to propose a shift in CWP's basic ideology. Tung called on party cadre to study the work of futurists such as Alvin Toffler, the Third Wave, and John Naisbitt, megatrends, as well as theorists of corporate organization such as ITD conglomerate chair Harold Janine. Claiming that many businessmen now recognize the irreversible crisis of capitalism, he proposed substituting the framework of the whole people for the working class and oppressed nationalities. To make this broader appeal effective, the term communist was to be dropped and democratic centralism replaced by a looser organizational structure. Tung asserted that it was time to shed the view that revolution required forcible overthrow of the state and establishment of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Our strategy is the parliamentary electoral approach for peaceful transition to socialism through local power. On this basis, Tung proposed that CWP transform itself into a new kind of organization able to attract large numbers of people, expressing confidence in rapid growth because of the quality of CWP's existing cadre corps. Tung's proposals were a hybrid of on-target criticisms of anti-revisionist orthodoxy, long-standing social democratic positions, and provocative interpretations of new technological and economic realities. Though most members initially followed his lead, CWP made no attempt to involve anyone beyond its own cadre and close sympathizers in its transformation. The group re-emerged in 1985 as the New Democratic Movement and recruited a few individuals who had been on CWP's periphery, but was unable to gather any sustained momentum. In fact, in the absence of strong central leadership and tight discipline, its cadre corps gradually began to go in different directions. Its most ambitious effort to gain influence within the Democratic Party in New York City was stalled by a major red baiting attack that relentlessly cited the rhetoric that CWP, now NDM, leaders had utilized just a few years before. Soon the group was fading badly, though no formal decision to dissolve was ever taken. By the late 1980s, CWP-NDM had ceased to exist. The downward spiral of the Democratic Workers' Party also began in the early 1980s. The first step was a Marlene Dixon-launched criticism of the changes DWP had made during its Tax the Corporations campaigns in 1979 to 1980 in the Bay Area, in order to incorporate a few hundred people who had been won to support the DWP's campaigns but who were unable or unwilling to become 24-hour-a-day cadre. The DWP had adjusted its membership requirements. Instead of summing this up as a very positive step toward becoming a working-class-based party, Dixon declared that this expansion had been a major social democratic error. All the new recruits were driven out, and the party was reduced to roughly the same 100 to 125 core cadre who had been members before 1979. Shortly after cracking down in the name of Bolshevik standards, Dixon decided that Marxist-Leninist doctrine was not revolutionary after all. In a series of papers distributed within the DWP in 1984, she declared that Marxism-Leninism as a strategy for revolutionary change in the advanced capitalist countries must be seen as a failure. Dixon argued that there was no possibility of liberating changes in the U.S. until its hegemony in the world economy was broken, which would supposedly come about through victories won by insurgencies in the Third World. This meant that the DWP should shift attention from efforts to organize U.S. workers around domestic issues to anti-imperialist and anti-militarist campaigns. To conduct such work, Dixon proposed retaining the DWP's form of organization and discipline while not calling it democratic centralism. In practice, this meant throwing almost all of DWP's energy into Central America solidarity work. DWP immediately dispatched members across the country to start a new solidarity group, the United States out of Central America, USOCA. While USOCA did some valuable work, its hostility to all other Central America solidarity efforts led to many conflicts within the anti-intervention movement, and DWP became even more isolated than before. Meanwhile, the political and financial demands on the remaining members intensified while Dixon jetted to international conferences. Demoralization spread, and for the first time disaffection appeared within Dixon's inner circle. In the fall of 1985, while Dixon was away at another conference, members of this inner circle convened a meeting of all members in the Bay Area and finally spoke frankly about the abuse of authority and alcoholism at the center of the organization. After a few additional meetings that included party members from across the country, the membership voted unanimously first to symbolically expel Dixon and then to dissolve the DWP. In the aftermath, there were bitter recriminations among former members, disputes over how to divide the remaining assets, and anger by many rank-and-file members at what they regarded as the inadequate self-criticism of Dixon's inner circle. A different fate awaited the two groups whose interaction and conflict had been central to the formation of the new communist movement back at the end of the 1960s. The RCP and PL survived through the 1980s, but both were completely marginal to the decade's resistance to Reaganism. The RCP continued to uphold cultural revolution Maoism and responded to the Jackson Rainbow upsurge with the slogan "The right to vote has been won. Now we need the sophistication and political awareness not to use it." Peel put forward the thesis that all the failures of the world communist movement stemmed from the notion, first proposed by Karl Marx, that societies had to pass through the stage of socialism before reaching a classless communist society, the Rainbow's demise. This new round of organizational implosions and infantile left posturing deepened questions about the already battered framework of anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism, but as long as a black-led progressive current kept a foothold in national politics, and as long as the Rainbow Coalition maintained its momentum, those movement survivors who had connected with this motion could retain some vitality. Indeed, based on the upbeat Rainbow Convention in the fall of 1987 and Jackson's 7 million votes in 1988, activists in the Rainbow left as well as LRS were optimistic. Then the roof caved in. In the final stages of the 1988 campaign and the immediate months afterwards, the weaknesses of the Rainbow came to the fore. Jackson's lack of accountability to his grassroots supporters became ever more pronounced as the candidate sought support among more established Democrats. A series of decisions to back mainstream figures who had opposed Jackson in 1984 against progressives who had thrown themselves into Jackson's first campaign alienated many activists. So did a series of steps he took toward scuttling the Rainbow's independent dimension. Tensions within the coalition grew, and in early 1989 the battle was joined over a proposal from Jackson's inner circle to alter the Rainbow's bylaws to ensure Jackson's complete control. The conflict pitted the Rainbow left and numerous local activists who had been in the trenches since 1984 against Jackson, the Rainbow's most conservative elements, and LRS. When the dust settled, Jackson had prevailed. Over the next year, activist participation in the Rainbow dried up, and the coalition itself was reduced to an appendage of Jackson and his entourage, a mere shadow of its former self. This outcome reflected the balance of forces within the Rainbow. From the outset, some participants regarded grassroots mobilization primarily as a bargaining chip for cutting a better deal with Democratic power brokers, while others considered building an independent popular movement paramount and regarded participation within the Democratic Party as an unwelcome but necessary tactic. No wall neatly separated these camps, and many Rainbow participants wobbled back and forth between them. Tensions up to and including the danger of a split were thus always part of the mix, but only this kind of alliance could have built a movement with the Rainbow's combination of progressive politics and mass appeal. The Rainbow's balance was upset, however, once the Democratic top leadership decided that it had more to gain by cutting a deal with Jackson than trying to freeze him out, and offered him a sort of semi-insider status in exchange for gutting the Rainbow's independence. The deal seemed more attractive to Jackson than the route of protracted opposition and alliance with a very weak left, especially since it meant solidifying his position as media-recognized spokesperson for the dispossessed. Indeed, he continues to play this role today, though in the last year or two with less influence and with less consistently progressive positions than in the 1990s. An individual with a different background and worldview might have made a different decision, but then such an individual would have had an even harder time than had Jackson in achieving recognition as a legitimate entrant in the electoral arena. In any case, Jackson's deal-cutting proved decisive for the Rainbow. The grassroots activists in and around the Rainbow left had gained much ground between 1984 and early 1989, but they had started from a position of weakness, and they did not have time to build a base strong enough to win a head-on fight against the Rainbow's charismatic leader. Nevertheless, the Rainbow's withering away was a severe setback for the progressive movement. no subsequent initiative has been able to galvanize the same level of energy or institutionalize the same degree of cooperation between activists in different sectors and localities. The Rainbow experience also indicates how differently things might have turned out if the new communist movement had come closer to meeting its goals. The Jackson Rainbow effort was not the 1917 to come that revolutionaries of the early 1970s expected, but it was definitely a large-scale flow of popular resistance. Had the youthful party builders of 1968 to 1973 been able to better traverse the tricky ground between 1973 and 1984, had they emerged as a multiracial organization of, say, 5 to 10,000 activists united around a generally revolutionary outlook instead of a constellation of competing sects, the possibility of making a difference in the shape of a mid-1980s rainbow, and hence within the country, would have been quite real. Even as it was, the battered forces of LRS, Line of March and others were able to make an impact, put their strengths together, in particular their commitment to anti-racism and internationalism and their well-developed organizing skills, and eliminate their debilitating vanguardism, and you would have had a left to reckon with. But as things actually developed, the revolutionary left was too weak to influence the overall shape of progressive politics in the 1980s. And as the Jackson movement and the Rainbow faded, they no longer provided an anchor for those party-building remnants that had immersed themselves in that environment. The result was inevitable. The fundamental ideological dilemmas that had lain dormant through the 1980s now came to the fore.